Thank you for joining. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this endgame between Wei with white and Tai Dai van Nguyen with black. And this is an endgame from the Prague Masters in round 8. And just some boy had some questions about it. It's a fascinating endgame. And thin lines between a draw and a win. And so in this endgame, black just checked with Rook a3, right? And then white has to decide where to go with the king, go up or go down. And so the first question from just some boy was, if you compare king e2, which was given as a blunder, and king d2, which apparently is winning, how can it be that king e2 is a draw and king d2 is winning? So I'm going to shed some light on it, and I think it's really a fascinating position. So the first thing, of course, to ask yourself, right, if you think about king d2, of course black has to take the bishop on f4, and then just like in the game, white advances their pawn to a6. But my first question is, can black take the pawn on f3? Does black have time for that? Right? It's like sometimes, right, when you start looking at a position, you just try to get a feel for the dynamics. And you try, I call it like brute force. It's like not really deep thinking, but it's more exploration to try to figure out what is actually the issue here. So, all right, so king e2 was played, and we will based on king d2 take, right, a6. Okay, and now my question is, what happens after rook f3, right? Because you play king e2, most likely, because you don't want to lose the pawn on f3. So I was just curious, right? Let's do the low-hanging fruit first. So, just some boy, I mean, can you see here a forced win for the white side? So let's try to do some thinking together. So in this position, right, I mean, you play king e2 to protect the pawn on f3. If you play king d2, then the pawn can be taken. So a7, right? Let's continue, rook a3, and then rook g8, right? And then after rook takes a7, there's rook g7, and otherwise the pawn promotes, and it's easy win. So the first thing, I think, to realize is when you think about king d2, that it's not dropping the pawn on f3, because black does not have the time to take that pawn. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is to ask yourself, right, if we look at what happened in the game, right, and what the defense was. King e2, g takes f4, a6, king e7, rook b6, right? So king e7, right? So now let's just go back, right? So, I mean, black has two defensive plans. Black can bring the king to the pawn, the a pawn, or bring the king to the king side and defend on the king side. So either the king goes to the a pawn or goes to, in this, like you see in this case, goes to the king side. So if we go back and we go to king d2, all right, we go and g takes f4, a6. And now let's have the same plan as black had in the game. So king e7, right? And now, right, we can see the difference. Let me just pull up the chat a little bit so I can see all the details. Yeah. How's the lag, BB? Thank you for joining so quickly. Anyway, so I just want to show, right? So the same plan has happened in the game, just to understand what is changing. Yeah. So white can play King C2, King F7, and now King B2, right? So if the king is on E2, you don't have this. You don't have this maneuver that you can attack the rook on A3 with the king. And I was actually right. It's of course fascinating, and we won't go into that in further detail. But I mean, if you want to explore this endgame further, right? If you just think about this endgame, right? So do you think this is an easy win for white or not? What do you think? Yeah, it's a win. CT says it's a win, yes. But, right, I mean, of course, let me explain what I mean with that, right? So when I was looking at this, I was thinking like, is this a fortress, right? We have a pawn defending the rook, so the king, right? The king cannot approach, right? It can get to d2, but cannot help the queen in dislodging the king from the pawn and winning the pawn on f4. So this is a whole chapter at itself, I think. But I was right. So, but this is winning for white. But for me, it was surprising to find out that this is not a fortress, because I was afraid that the white king cannot approach and the black king can just make rounds like king f5, king g4, king f3. So how do you squeeze the king out? We're not going to look at that. That's beyond the analysis of this position. But this is, of course, important for the whole understanding of the endgame, that this is not a fortress, right? I mean, it looks. I mean, we can spend later time on it, but we were doing the orientation, right? We were trying to figure out. We were in this position, right? Rook a3, and we had two moves to consider, right? And we said king e2, which Yi played instantly, defending the pawn, and king d2, and then king e2 got double exclamation mark, and then it was for a while a draw, but Yi went on to win the game anyway. So we try to understand what the difference is. So what we have discovered so far, right, is that after king d2, and like say a6, black cannot take, right, so king d2, take on f4, a6, black cannot take on f3. That's important to understand. The second thing is that if we look at the same defense that we saw in the game, that's based on king e7 and then king f7 and waiting with the king here. If the king is on d2, you're one tempo closer to the rook, and you can harass the rook. And also, right, let's just now think about the general plans for white, right? So I think if you think about the whole situation, right? So if you think about king d2, one of white plans would be, right, to go king d2, go here, right, and then, for instance, play something like rook b6, and then move the king up and support the promotion of the a pawn. So that's one of the white plans. If the king goes to the king side. So that's one of the plans. So it depends on what black does. what kind of strategy white will follow. So why is it right? Because you can say, right, king d2, g takes f4, a6, right? So we saw king e7, king c2, king f7, king b2, right? And now if the rook goes up, then the king goes up, and then the white king will start supporting the promotion of the a pawn, right? So that's one of the plans for white, is to move up the b file. Then the rook can protect the king against checks, and then promote the pawn, and then black has to give up their rook against the pawn, and white is winning. So that's one of the ideas. So now the question is, right, after king d2, what could be another defense, right? So the other defense could be that this king goes to the pawn here, right? And basically keeps this pawn in check. So let me show you what I mean with that. So a6, king c7, right? And now, I mean, it's really surprising. There is only one winning move for white, right? The only winning move here for white is king e2. Only winning move, right? And now you can, of course, right? The idea is the king is close enough to the pawn to stop the pawn, right? I cannot lose the f3 pawn, and I'd like to win the f4 pawn. And I can win the f4 pawn with a move like rook f4, f6, rook f4, or with this maneuver, right? Depending on what the king will do. And then we're going to lose the a pawn, but we're going to cut off the black king who has committed themselves to go to the queen side, right? So think about this rook is going to take on f4, and then we put the rook on d4, and we have cut off the rook, the king by 2 lines. So that's all right. So we found white, depending on what black does, as one plan of running with the king to the b file, then up, support the promotion of the a pawn. Black is too slow to take the f3 pawn. The other plan, if black says, I'm going to free my rook by moving my king to c7, then the plan is to win the f pawn, then put the rook on d4, give up the a pawn, and then win the subsequent pawn landing, right? So let me show you, right, I mean, how that would work. So rook e3, king f2, right? Okay, not surprising, only move. So I was just thinking like black is just waiting, right? Because now you can see king g2. I'm just waiting. I don't want king h3 to happen, rook f6. I'm just waiting, right? I don't want to commit. Rook f4. Rook takes a6. Rook d4. King c6. King g3. f4. So, BB saying that's still not such a trivial win considering how far down the board the pawn is, right? All right, so I want to switch later to the book by Herman Grote. And so he had the rule of 5, right? So he said, if the pawn is on the 4th rank and you have like two files, right? It's 2 files, and the pawn on the 4th rank, it's 4 plus 2, pawn on the 4th, and then cut off by 2, together is 6, white is winning. So this is, if you look at the theory and you look at Tovaretsky and others, this is a game position that is pretty well covered, right? So this is important, that if you can get the pawn to the 4th rank and you have a cutoff by 2, you have 4 plus 2 is more than 5, and you're winning. So what is meant with more than 5, right? So if we go back, so if we think about this, pawn on the 3rd rank, generally speaking, is not winning, right? You have to have 3 files in between. So you, right, the king, so the rook had to be on, let's say, c4 and the king on b5. If the pawn is on the 5th rank, you need 1 file. So it's like 5 plus 1, 4 plus 2, and 3 plus 3. That's kind of the general rule. But, of course, these are rules, right? And there are always specific positions. So, I think it's very interesting, right? So, to see king c7, right? So, black says, I'm going to free my rook. So, the black king guides, protects against the promotion of the white pawn, right? Now, only winning move, king e2, of course, you have to defend the pawn, you cannot lose it. Rook e3, of course, only winning move is king f2, because I cannot lose the pawn. Rook a3, right? Now, I mean, I can play rook f6, I can play king g2. Black says, I'm just waiting, right? I mean, and then rook f6, rook a3, take the pawn, rook d4, king c6. And this king c6, right? So let me just show you, right? If in this position I would play f4, it's a draw, because black can cut off the king, right? So I still have to be careful, right? I can cut off the king. And so also let's have a look, right? Let's say I play king g3, right? King c5. Okay, the rook is under attack. And in this position, right? So now it's surprising, you get the rook d3 is still winning. So what I just said about the rule of 5, you would say here the pawn is on the 3rd rank, but based on the placement, this is still a win, and we can look at that later. So now let's have a look. King e2 was played in the game, right? G takes f4, a6, king e7, and now, of course, I mean, I cannot play rook d2, king d2, but I'm just too late, right? If you think about here, if I would play, everything is a draw, but I mean, I cannot attack the rook in a timely manner. So that one tempo between king e2 and king d2 makes all the difference. And now you can see, right? They're just going to wait there. And then rook b7. So the black just waits on that side, right? And how did the game continue? a7, king e5 is a draw. Black protects their pawn. King d2. Now, of course, the king wants to go to b2. King d4, still a draw. Rook d7. King c4, still a draw. Rook c2. Still a draw. Rook a2. King b1. So Nguyen played it perfectly. Rook a6, king b2. So the rook wants to follow that plan that I was discussing, right? And now, what was the last move? Rook a5, rook c7. And now this black king had to go to b5 to go to the pawn on a7. That was the way to draw. So now, I mean, we're not done yet, right? Because we understand kind of the difference between king d2 and king and king e2, right? That king d2 allowed this maneuver king c2, king b2, when the king is going to the king side. And we saw that we can otherwise also, when the king goes to the queen side, we can win the f4 pawn and then cut off by two files. But, right, one of the options that was not considered, so let me get rid of the arrows, is here, right? There are two moves, right? You can play king c4 and king d4, right? So let me show you. King c4, right? And g takes f4, and we have a draw, right? So this is, so let me show you, right? Why? So let me show you the difference between king d4 and king c4, right? Because you would say, oh, this king is closer to the pawn, right? So we go a6, king c7, only move to make a draw, a7, king b7, right? So the king completely commits. Now the king returns, says, I'm going to win the f4 pawn. So king c6, king takes f4, rook a8, king g4. So what did we have before? We had the pawn on f4, right? So now we have a situation. If the rook was on d3, right, we saw that it was winning. If the pawn is on f4, it is winning. But with the pawn on f3 and the rook on d4, this is a draw. And there are two moves that make a draw. The two moves that make a draw here are rook g8, frontal checks, and the other one is king c5, right? So king c5 is kind of, right, the way it actually works is that this rook would like to cut off the king and at the same time defend the pawn on f4, so the king can, right, the king can make their march, and then later, right, when the king has advanced far enough, I can switch to one file and then advance the pawn and I have a winning ending. But if I play king c5 here, right, there's no freedom here for this rook. The rook has to choose, and it has to choose between giving up the two files or continuing to protect, but then they have to give up a file, right? So this is the most active position for the black king. And it's very tricky, right? Because you could say, I would like to have my king actually on f7. Not possible because you're cut off, but or you would like to have it sometimes, right? You like to have it on c7 so you can play rook d8 and make some kind of bridge. And if the pawn is all the way back, there are situations where you can go into a pawn ending that is a draw, but not in this case. So this puts pressure on the rook, and the rook has to give up their dual function of protecting f4 and cutting off the king by two files. So that's one, right? So let's look at rook g8, right? So that's the other. Now the pawn is undefended, so I cannot make any progress. So that's the situation. So king c4, right? So we were having the position here, and we were asking ourselves, what is the difference between king c4 and king d4, right? So king c4 is a draw, because in the whole line that follows, right, we are one move further away from the pawn on f4. So in the other line where we played king d2, we were also losing one tempo with king e2 because we could not get to b2 on time. In this case, right, our strategy is based on getting to f4, and we are one move later to get to f4. So let me show you the difference, right? King d4, take, a6, king goes here. So I'm just playing the same. King e4, only winning move, right? Okay, we take, right? We cut off the king by two files. we take, the king tries to be active, king goes up, and now, right, what is the difference between the whole line where we had king c4 and king d4? In this case we get f4 in time, and we have our standard rule of 5, where you have two lines in between, a pawn on the 4th rank, 4 plus 2 is greater than 5, and it's a winning position. So, yes, so very fascinating. Just some boy, what do you think? What do you think? I mean, what are your questions? This is what I found so far, right? I mean, there's still so much more to explore. And this is actually, you can see it's very difficult. But if we look at the right, if we go back, what I'm saying is king e2, right? Black can get to it, takes the bishop, and then has the time to go to f7. And after king d2, we saw that we are one step closer to b2, and black doesn't have the time to take on f3. And then when we were going up, we saw that after king c4, right, we end up with position with the pawn on the 3rd rank, and after king d4 we end up with a pawn on the 4th rank, and that's the difference between a draw and winning. A pawn on the 4th rank with a cutoff of 2 files is winning. A pawn on the 3rd rank, generally speaking, is not winning. So yes, so I'd like to switch. I have to, I will have to adjust my screen a little bit, so bear with me, because I was a bit late for the stream, but I'm going to show the book, the Chess Endgame book for club players by Herman Grote. Okay, so there's one more question. Rook a3. Okay, so let's go. So here we go. And the question was king c2, right? So g takes f4, right? Okay, so let's continue, right? On the same thing. Only move king c7. Yes, and now I see why king c2 on the first move is not winning too. So the king does not go to f7, right? Like we have in the case of king e2. And but the king goes to c7, and you can already feel the difference, but right? This feels very symmetric in a way, right? I mean, so let's continue, right? In the other one line we were playing. This. How did we continue in the other line? It's even. The question is, how do we defend our pawn on f3, right? I mean, we don't even have. We cannot defend our pawn, and we cannot defend our pawn on a. So this is actually king c2. Okay. Right, g takes f4, okay. a6. This is we don't have a king to defend the e-pawn. King c7, a7, king b7. Okay, what do we want to do? Give a check. But you can. I mean, the king is nowhere, right? This is like you're losing f3 and you're losing a7, and then you can just make a draw. I don't see any improvement actually for anything where you say, oh, that's a real good try, right? It's also right, I mean, and everything draws, right? Yeah. So king c2 is, yeah, it's the easiest draw of them all, you could say, probably. Yes. Okay. So, yes, and so I think I just want to reiterate one thing. So what was very important is that so now, right, yeah, you're going for frontal checks, and yeah, the pawn is on the third rank. So, I mean, what would you try here, right? King g4. Yes. So rook d3, I just wanted to say here, there's only one drawing move, which is this one, right? So it's not a check, but it's bringing this king to the active position. I mean, if you were to ask me, would you remember that for a game? I can feel it, right? That I want to be able to challenge this rook for their dual function. But it's interesting to see that after rook f8, right, you're actually losing. But this brings me to the book that I want to show. So I have to reorganize the screen a bit because it's not laid out for that. So bear with me. All right, here we go. Cutting off the king. So cutting off the king, okay. Actually, the rook prevents the enemy monarch from approaching an important pawn. So here we go. And the vertical cut, right? So let's see, it's not following. Here we are. Okay, so this is one cut, right? So this is not relevant yet for us. The endgame in practice. Okay, so let's move on. And we get to this position, right? So let's have a look. So this is actually from Maxim Vyshelagraph against Ian Nepomniachtchi. Rook d5, king c7. So let's continue, and then we get to this position. King e4. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up, and so the chat will be a bit gone, but it's more important that you see it clearly. And I will be gone too. But not completely. So here we are. Okay, one moment. Start to feel like Eric Rosen. He's always like this, right? All right, so this is probably better to follow. This is black's strategy in principle. He puts his rook on the back rank to harass white's king with checks. So those were the frontal checks I was talking about. As soon as it leaves its hiding place. All right, so let's see how this continues. Okay, I can open it up a little bit further. King e4. Right? King e4. This is the principled way to win this ending. There are more wins, like moving the rook down to d1, but it's also easy for white to go wrong here. If white thinks he can push the pawn forward, he will be rudely awakened since f5. Black can go rook d8, right? So this is the transposition to a pawn ending that I was saying. Like sometimes you want to have this king active on c5, but sometimes you want to be able to convert into a pawn ending. So now the rook is on c7, and after f5 you can play rook d8, forcing the rook to give up one file. Okay, so let's continue with the winning path. King e4, king c6. Since the pawn ending is hopeless now, black tries to move his king in the direction of the white rook to harass it until it leaves the d4 square, right? So this is this dual purpose role of the king on c5. Either the rook has to give up the defense of the pawn on f4, or the rook has to give up protecting both paths. So rook, king e5, check, king f6, right? So now you can see how important it is. Now we see the importance of the rook on d4. It keeps the f4 pawn covered, otherwise a check on f8 would drive the white's black king back again. And that's what we saw in some of the, you could say, where the pawn was on the third rank. So we continue, king c5, right? And now rook d7. Obviously white keeps the vertical cutoff intact. King c6, rook e7. So now, right, the white king is far enough advanced that white is willing to give up one file, right? Because black can no longer exchange. Rook f8, king e5. Now black's king also gets a shoulder budge, and the pawn can no longer be stopped. And so Nepo resigned, right? So now we saw kind of how you convert this endgame with two files in between. Let me see, we are now in horizontal cuts, if there's any more vertical cuts. Okay, the rule of 5, right? So let's go back there, like I was explaining. And the number of the rank on which the pawn is standing with the number of files by which the king is cut off from the defender. If the sum is more than 5, it is a win in most cases. If not, it is normally a draw, right? So this is 4 plus 2, 5 plus 1, 3 plus 3. That's the rule of 5. Are you still being able to follow it? I mean, I don't have the chat anymore on the screen, but I can see it on the side. So now, right, you can see we get in all these, right? So this is from the Yuri Averbach endgame manual. So you can see here we have a pawn on the 4th rank. There's one exception, which is the G pawn and the B pawn, right? Because in that case, the king has more difficulty hiding from checks. So this rule that we were just discussing, 4 plus 2, works for all the pawns except for the B and the G. So let me just continue, because I want to show you one thing which is like an exception. And So this was the, right, this is the, so now we have 5 plus 1. It's all being explained. Let's not go here. I wanted to show you one more thing. So here we see Posny against Bok, Rook d5, right? So we have a pawn on the second rank. So he wants to have a cutoff. And you can see that the recommended move is King c6, immediately questioning this rook and the dual function that the rook has to have later on in protecting the pawn and cutting off on 2 files. Yeah, so let's not go further into this exercise. I just want to show you one thing that is also in this book, which is the pawn on the third rank. Fourth rank. Okay, here we are. So first we make the sum, third rank, 2 file cut makes 5, so with the rule in mind, black should be able to draw. Unfortunately for him, his king is very poorly placed on f7, right? So if this king would be, I don't know, on f4 or something, it would be better. And so they also cannot play rook e8 because after a trade, the white king gets to the key squares. Right? And so I wanted to show you this position, right? So you can see there are exceptions. If the rook defends the pawn on the third rank, defending it, and the black king in this case is very poorly placed, right, and not active, not let's say on f4, challenging the rook and the cutoff over the 2 files, then a white can still win, right? So you can see. So the king, right, and he really tries to get to this active square. Rook e5. And now rook c5. So this is, so you can see that if you have a position like this, right, you bring up the king and then at the right moment, just like we saw in the game between MVL and Nepal, you give up your 2-rank, the 2-file cutoff, and you convert into another winning endgame. And in this case, it would happen with a rook c5. Yes. Yes, so that was kind of what I wanted to share about this endgame by Yi. Rook d2 versus rook e2, king e2 versus king d2, and king c4 versus king d4. And the fact that there were 2 strategies, one was to go with the king to the b file and then support the a pawn. The other one was to win the f pawn and then cut off the king on 2 files. So that was the other strategy, and the strategy depended on what black was doing. Just some boy, does that kind of answer your question that you had in the YouTube channel? Okay, great. Yeah, that was it for today. I was fascinated by the question and I just wanted to share my research that I did so far. I mean, there's still more to do. I mean, if you're right, there was this fortress that was potentially there with the pawn and the rook versus the queen, where the name of this book. Yeah, the name of this book is Chess Endgame for Club Players by Herman Groten. Yeah, so he's a Dutch trainer, and he published this book. So, okay. Thank you for joining. Bye, everybody.